Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Goff, and I'm Principal Product Marketing here at Revenera, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webcast, The R&D Dilemma, Build or Buy Systems for Entitlement, Licenses, and Usage Management. We have a great panel for you today to share their experiences and insights on the familiar software supplier struggle of build versus buy. So I'm really excited to have with us Ravi Mazumdar, VP of Engineering, Nicole Segerer, VP of Products and Marketing, and Urge Kose, Solution Engineer, all with us today. Before we get started, though, I'd like to take a moment just to go over a few housekeeping details. First, today's discussion will be roughly 40 to 45 minutes long. And if you have any questions along the way, please add your questions and your comments in the Q&A tab, and we will try to answer them as we go or at the end as time allows. And be assured, if we don't get to your questions, we will follow up with you individually after the event. Finally, we will send you a link to the recording in the next 48 hours. And be sure to check out the related materials we've provided in the resource area. So let's get started. So I wanted to start with this sketch because I think it rings true, and it's a fun thing to kick off the session with. It's from Brendan Leonard, also known as Semi-Rad, who, if you read Outside Magazine or similar publications, you may be familiar with him, but he's a writer and he's an ultramarathon runner, which means he runs more than 26.2 miles at a time. And he's run numerous 100-mile trail races. He's definitely someone who is talented, accomplished, and he can get things done. And even though he is skilled in DIY home improvement, I'd say that his perspective on build versus buy is definitely relevant to our conversation today. And it shows a lot of self-awareness and transparency. And on the theme of transparency, I want to be upfront with you. While the topic of today's discussion is build versus buy, I think you know where we're going to land on this question. But as software suppliers yourselves, I suspect that you've likely had different versions of this discussion internally and even with your own prospects and customers. So our goal today is to examine this question in the context of licensing and entitlement management. But I think the reasoning will sound familiar to you and will make sense as you make your own build versus buy decisions and develop your own business cases. So with that, let's begin with you, Nicole. Let's start with some context before we dig into whether a software supplier should build or buy. What is licensing and entitlement management, and why is it important?
Yeah, good question, Michael. And thanks, everyone, for joining us here today. Licensing, entitlement management, software monetization is super important and the backbone of any successful software business. But yet, it's something that your end users, in the best case, shouldn't even see, right? Because they don't care. They want to use your software. But what you need to ensure in the back end is that you protect your IP, meaning that only those customers who have paid you can use your software, and to the extent that they've paid you, right? You need to make sure that you actually do get paid, meaning keeping renewal times under control, making sure that you only deliver software to customers that are your customers, and so on and so on. And you also want to reach new markets, right? So you want to work through channel, you want to create different versions of your software, you want to work with trials. All of these things really matter. And all of these things, for them to be successful, they require entitlement management and licensing in the back end. In simple words, you need to know who has a right to use your software, and you need to have the means in place to enforce or fulfill that, right? Meaning that you get the software out to customers and you manage the access to the software based on what the customers have paid for. So when you think about building that yourself, right? And this is coming from, as you know, Revenera has been in the space of software monetization, licensing, and entitlements for 30 years. So while this is our core business, we also have a lot of experience with, of course, building it. And we've worked with many, many customers who have built their own software monetization, licensing, and entitlement management functionality themselves. And just like with every build versus buy project, and evaluation. When you look at it in the first place, it might sound super simple, right? I need to know who my customers are, check, I know this. I need to know what they have access to, check, I know this. I need to manage that in my application. Okay, I'm going to ask some developers to get that done. But when you really think deeper and you go through what it entails, you end up with a lot of different topics. And we have listed out some of those in the word cloud here. if we wanted to go deeper, we could make a word cloud that's probably 5 and 10 times as big, right? You need to think about, what do I do if the applications that are licensed go offline for a while? What if they are air-gapped and never online? How do I get software updates out to my customers? What do I do in counting overuse? What do I do about licensing always being available, because it cannot hinder the use of the software, right? What do I do about my billing process? How do I go about the integration with all my back office systems, upstream and downstream? There's many questions that become part of a build versus buy discussion in licensing and entitlement management. And often we see that on the surface, it might look easy, but then when you go a little bit deeper to really implementing something like that yourself, it becomes highly complex. It takes a lot of time, and it's also something that's always growing. So it's a big thing, right? Companies that attempt to build it themselves, they usually take a lot of resources. And the one big question that we will discuss and look at from a couple of different points here in the webinar today is, where should the focus be, right? Licensing and entitlement management is super important to you, but as I mentioned in the beginning, it's nothing that your customers even want to see. They want it to be invisible, seamless, right? And you need to look at, where do I want to spend my time? What is the trade-off between developing operational functions like this and some of the features, right? And we will look into some of that today in the webinar. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Nicole. So Urge, speaking of licensing and complexity and entitlement management, it really is more about than just granting access to an application. Can you talk about some of the different licensing models you're seeing when you're meeting with customers and prospects?
Absolutely, Michael. I mean, I think we all have a familiarity with the traditional perpetual licensing model, and we are aware of a whole industry shift away from it to subscription, driven by consumer demands around getting access to technology without that initial capital expenditure, and driving for a more operational expense model. As you know, traditional license types, node locked, concurrent or floating, and then a bit of a newcomer, should we say, of user-based licensing. What I see with my prospects and customers alike is that these aren't just siloed license types. They're commonly a hybrid scenario of being mixed and matched. Take Netflix, for example. Yes, the licensing is against a particular user, but that user is only enabled for 3 streams to 3 different devices at the same time. That's a user licensing model and a concurrent or a shared licensing model concatenated together. The new kid on the block that everyone wants to be like is consumption. Consumption is a whole spectrum of different licensing models. If you think about it, you got anything from, all you can eat Amazon Web Service way of doing things, where you just consume, and you get charged at the end of it, to a phone plan model where you get a set amount of minutes a month, and you either use them or you lose them, to token based, where you buy a set amount, you consume against that set amount, and differentiation of the functionality can also affect the amount of the token you can consume. You have to consume. There's also other more bespoke consumption metrics as well. I mean, a great one that I see is if you can articulate the value that you save to your end users, then taking a cut of that saving is a great outcome-based licensing approach.
Thanks, Urge. And Nicole, I know you talk to a lot of prospects and customers too. In the course of those conversations, are you seeing some of their plans change based on what they learn when they're exposed to things like this?
Yeah, very, very often, and maybe not so often in the basic functionality, but in the nuances. And when you think about those nuances, they will determine how your whole strategy works, right? So, for example, of course, there's bigger strategic projects in which companies move from, let's say, perpetual to subscription. That is something that is well planned. But Urge talked about, consumption models being the new cool thing, right? A lot of companies are adopting that. But when you look at what is a compliance model around consumption, for example, would I allow overage? Would I not? How much of it? That is something that is ever changing. And as companies go through their pricing and packaging strategies, they tend to change their decisions on that. And even when the software is published and out the door, this is something that changes. So a requirement for any solution that covers entitlements and licensing would be that it's flexible so that it can adapt. And what we are also seeing just in general is most software suppliers are offering SaaS solutions today. In a SaaS world, pricing and packaging becomes a competitive differentiator, which also means it wouldn't stay the same for years and years and years as it might have in the past. So we see a lot of SaaS companies fine-tuning their pricing and packaging, which means that they are, changing the details of a lot of the models that they have. And they don't want to be held back. If it's a competitive differentiator, I want to be quick to market, fast to market with it. And if I first need to go and build something, right, that might cost me months or even longer, right? So that's where we see that a lot of flexibility is needed now from a supporting platform.
Yeah, that's a great point, because obviously you don't know what you don't know, and one of the benefits of being Revenera and being in the industry is you understand all the use cases, whereas on the vendor side, the software supplier side, your view of licensing and entitlement management may be informed by a few trusted customers that said, here's what we want to do, here's how we want it deployed, here's how we want to pay for it. But unless they get those other use cases presented to them, they may have no idea how much bigger the scope of it could be, or what some of the benefits could be. So thank you for that, Nicole. So let's move on to talking about some approaches to DIY and doing it yourself. And let's look a bit more closely to some of the pros and cons of building your own licensing and entitlement management. So Urge, you've likely seen customers and prospects that have tried leveraging existing systems to meet their licensing and entitlement management needs. Can you talk about how that plays out?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the initial pro that you can think about is, why not just use what I already have? Come on, I don't need to spend any more. Let's just use what we have. But leveraging systems that aren't purposely designed for entitlement management and licensing is going to have some drawbacks. I mean, yes, a CRM or an ERP has some notion of an entitlement, but how far does it go with acting upon that record of an entitlement? Essentially, in my experience, it boils down to a row entry in a database. There's no real actions that can come of that unless you build bespoke systems and code around that record to invoke some actions based upon it. So yeah, a great point is, you build that bespoke system, you're in charge of that from now on, and it's really unique to your use case. So any internal knowledge holders, if they ever leave, you're going to have to retrain staff on that aspect of that code. A great example of another system being leveraged for licensing purposes, especially in the SaaS world, is identity access management systems. Things around Okta, Ortho, or Azure AD. I see this all of the time. Why can't I just make a role for my user so that it differentiates the functions that they're exposed to in my SaaS application? Well, that works into some degree. But when what you're going to have to make up for in the IAM, the Identity Access Management System, is you're going to have to build product logic code into your SaaS application. So the role of the user might be his bronze role, but what does that translate to in your application in terms of features and functionality that they are exposed to? Now, if you hard code those that application logic, that logic into your application, then you're going to have reliance on your engineering team to change that in the future. So you're not going to be able to, be agile, as Nicole was saying, in updating your pricing and packaging and keep up with competitors or keep up with new consumer demands.
Thanks, Urge. And Ravi, as VP of Engineering, I know for a fact that you regularly tackle the builder buy dilemma. Can you talk a little bit about the pros and cons of developing functionality outside of a supplier's core competencies?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Michael. So, as you all know, engineers love to, build things. They thrive on innovation. And they get excited when they build, new stuff. But we also know that engineering resources are, hard to find, especially these days. I mean, we've all heard about, the Great Resignation and how difficult it is to not only retain but to hire new engineers. So the engineers that you have, you really need to focus on making sure that they focus and spend most of the time on your core competency, and that's where the differentiator is to assess what your core competency is, and invest all your resources or majority of your resources to focus on that, versus things that can be bought and maintained. Because anything that you build, you have to keep in mind that in this SaaS world, you also have to maintain and operate and support. So a couple of examples that I have used to make that decision of a build versus buy is in our own environment, we have a data warehouse, we have a reporting solution that presents visualizes how our customers are using our system, and we had an option of building it ourselves, because that way we would own everything and we could control everything, versus go and invest in buying a solution from the outside that would give us the benefit and the improvements that come with that evolving solution over time. So we chose to invest in a data warehouse solution, a third-party data warehouse solution, as well as an embedded analytics solution to help meet our customer needs, but without investing too many of our engineering resources in it. So it really boils down to focusing on your core competency, and it is both an art and a science that that come in here.
For sure. And we'll dig in a second into some more of the specific engineering considerations. But Nicole, sometimes a supplier will decide to do nothing. How often do you see that? And what are the results of that decision?
I see it quite a bit, and more often, frankly, than I would expect it to happen. The reason is that, especially when new products get taken to market, there's a lot of pressure from the business to get them out the door, right? Which means that the whole focus is on building the product, and everything else becomes an afterthought, right? It becomes another thing that we will do later. So there's a good number of use cases where suppliers decide to roll out a product with basically no software monetization functionality in it. It's good because you're not investing time and money on that in the first place. But technically, everything that is out the door without a proper monetization strategy is something that you have to rein back in later at a certain point, and that is where it becomes really painful. It becomes painful to track who actually has access to it, who is using it, how much revenue leakage do I have? When asking, it's a very good point to quantify the pain here, right? When you talk to someone who's built their own licensing and entitlement management functionality, and you ask them how much revenue leakage they might have, they will be able to give you a pretty good idea of where their weak areas are and what it could potentially mean for them. When you talk to someone who has done nothing, they will not even have an idea of how much revenue they might be losing, and what it would mean, because it's just impossible to quantify. You're not measuring, you're not counting. There's nothing there that you could rely on in terms of data, and that is something that haunts some companies for a very long time. When it's an on-premise product, there's nothing that you could do about those versions that are out there technology. And if it's SaaS or cloud even, right, it's easier to rein it back in, but even that can be painful. It can also be a very disrupting customer experience, right? So it's one of those things that might seem like a good idea in the beginning when you're under time pressure, but it's one of the things that come back and bite you later. And that's something that companies should consider.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Nicole, about when you build it yourself and the engineering resources required to then go back and change it, you're pulling them away from the roadmap, which is a great segue now for Ravi. Can you talk a little bit more about some of those specific engineering considerations? We brought out the big guns for this webinar. We're very glad to have you here with your experience. What should people be thinking about?
Yeah, so when you take into account, costs, right, engineering considerations, initially, back in the perpetual license days, we would be focused on building a particular, piece of functionality, and that would be delivered to the customer, and the customer would buy that particular piece of functionality. In the world of subscription, they rent your software, and they expect you to be continuously providing updates, not just support for that piece of functionality, but evolve that piece of functionality and keep it going. And this is an ongoing cost that one needs to, factor in. The other thing that, you need to factor in is how to keep your code secure. It's always an afterthought, but it is becoming more of a pre-thought right now, where you have to focus on making sure that the code that you write is secure. There are some various models that are in place that allow you to invest more time and resources to make sure that your code is secure. And any piece of code that you write has more investment goes into making it secure. And the piece of code that you don't write, you don't have to worry about that. So there is less cost associated in keeping the code secure. I've talked about hiring and retention challenges in the previous question that you asked, Michael. Resources are at a premium these days all across the world. It is not a particular region or area that is impacted, but everywhere in the world, technical competent engineers are at a premium, and they have huge opportunities to move from your company to another. And that's why you have to be very careful to invest the small set of resources that you have on your core competency, rather than spend it on things that are not a part of your core competency. The cloud has an impact out here as well. Back in the days of on-premise solutions, there is a cost that you had. Even though you bought a piece of software or a solution, there was a cost associated for you to maintain that solution on premise, manage it, and keep it going. With cloud, there's that cost is gone. You can simply just pay a subscription fee to a solution provider and get everything soup to nuts without investing any of your time except the actual use of that piece of functionality. So these are the considerations that I would use in making that decision. Outside of the initial build part of any piece of functionality or solution.
Thanks, Ravi. And that's a great point about core competencies. As Nicole said earlier, the whole notion of licensing and entitlement management being something that should be basically invisible to your end customer. They want to focus on what your core customer competencies are. And we want our engineers focused on the roadmap and delivering those features. And, like you said, with subscription, making sure that you're constantly iterating and evolving your applications. Exactly. So thank you. So let's move on and talk about, building the business case. Let's see, Nicole, once a supplier has made that initial investment in building its own solution, what are some of the things it should consider about how that solution evolves over time?
Yeah, that's a great point, Michael, right? Very often when a business case always has to be built, by the way, no matter if you buy or build. I've seen many business case models for a do-it-yourself, build your own, right? And what all of those have in common is that they deliver a pretty accurate picture of the initial investment, engineering wise. It's going to take us so and so many months and so and so many people to build this, right? And then sometimes there is an assumption on ongoing maintenance, which really only is maintenance and support. What often gets underestimated is how much any solution will have to change over time, right? So you're not building once and then you're using it for the next years. You're basically going through cycles of building and building on top. That is usually driven through the points that we see here on the left-hand side, right? We talked about in the beginning, new licensing and monetization models come into play. They need to be supported. New deployment models come in, right? You go from on-premise to hosted cloud to full multi-tenant SaaS. That needs a different approach that requires development. Very often, M&A activities come into play, right? So new solutions are being bought, there's mergers, all of that, and in the end, it's got to be a consistent customer experience, which means that there's work to do there too. Otherwise, you end up with a lot of different silos. We'll talk about that later, and that will deliver a really difficult customer experience. And at some point, your engineering cost will shoot high up. And then, of course, summarizing it, it's ongoing development. Anyone who decides to go down that path, and that path might be okay, by the way, for some companies to build it themselves, right? It's if that is the right decision to make, that's fine. But any company deciding about this should really plan in that there is ongoing development. And if you're just counting the maintenance cost, you're likely missing out on a massive piece of investment that you have to bring in following years.
Thanks, Nicole. And Ravi, can you talk about the costs of building your own solution? What are some of the assumptions that get overlooked when you go down that path?
Yeah, so we talked about the costs of allocating engineers, not on your core competency, but on something that's more peripheral. There's costs associated with that because you're taking engineers away from that. One also we miss the challenges and the costs of hiring new engineers. So if you wanted to build a new piece of functionality that is not your core competency, you need to hire that team and build out a team, because nobody has unlimited headcount that's sitting on a bench ready to start writing code. And if there is a company out there, then I'm interested in talking to that company and the leaders out there. So there are challenges and there are costs associated with hiring, which means that you take resources from your existing team to do the interviews, source out these candidates, hire them, train them. All these costs are not accounted for, and we have to keep those in mind. And all this, what it does, it takes time, effort, and resources away from your core competency. If you were to go buy a solution, especially a SaaS and a cloud-based solution, you would go and get a budget approved to go spend money, and you would cut a PO for it, and you're there, you're done. So that's the difference.
Great.
I think,
go
sorry.
ahead.
I think there's also an additional aspect to this, which is opportunity cost on if you did build your own solution, on having to be reactive to the market. So you either set up your own monetization team to continuously evaluate the market and see what consumer demands are, changing, how they're evolving, how the consumers of your software want to, use your software in the future. They have to be constantly researching that, or you have to be reactive and, basing it upon either consumer demands directly, which is not always to your own favor of maximizing your own revenue, or adapting to your competitors, having to be the second in line to their forward-thinking strategies. So there's definitely opportunity cost of, having to do all of that research yourself. Whereas if Revenera, we do this day in, day out. We probably work with multitude of customers within the direct industry that you work with, and it's our job to be those innovators on your behalf and get you to a position to exploit our technology when you are ready to, exploit those new monetization models as they come about.
Yeah, fantastic points, Urge. Thank you. So let's shift a little bit and talk about building a business case. Nicole, can you walk us through what that looks like when you're making that build or buy decision for licensing and entitlement management, and some of the benefits from both a revenue and growth and operational efficiency perspective look like?
Absolutely, and that ties right into the points that Urge just made, right? Done right, licensing and entitlement management becomes more than an operational function. It becomes a driver for top line gains and for operational efficiency, so bottom line savings. We are not having a full ROI discussion here. There's a lot to be said about a business case, but when you look at this slide here and you go through it a little bit, you'll see how broadly it touches on all different areas of your business, right? So when you're looking into bringing entitlements and licensing into your business, it's about capturing new revenue, right? So you might change your pricing packaging model and grow the revenue. You might want to go into new markets, which is typically a top line driver. We talked about go to market for new products or acquired products. Any few months or even a year that you take a product to market later is costing you a lot of money, right? So the sooner you get out there, the more you make. The channel performance is something that is highly valuable for a lot of software suppliers out there, but often as an afterthought when building it your own, right? How do channel partners interact with the entitlements of the customers that they sold? Then, of course, renewal rates. Renewal rates always need to go up. In a subscription world, there's nothing more important than renewal rates. So making sure that the renewal is monitored, the date is clear, the customer is informed about it, and the fulfillment activities are in plan so that when the renewal doesn't happen or it happens late, you're reacting accordingly. That becomes very important. And then, of course, the customer experience. That's, as we all know here, influence just about everything. If your customer is not happy with either your software or the way you work with them, then they are at risk really quickly, even if the software does the job, right? So what we want to do as software suppliers is provide an experience that's really good. And all of that, of course, drives the top line, plus on top, recovering lost revenue by protecting IP and making sure that intentional or unintentional overuse is restricted. And then, of course, there's a lot of operational efficiency where at first sight, software monetization seems like a niche topic. When you think about it longer, it's touching on product management, it's touching on your operations team, it's touching on your support team, and a lot of people are working with it. So if they have a centralized system to work with on which they get trained once and then serves the whole company, there's a lot of operational efficiencies and bottom line savings to be gained. Just because you're making it easier for your internal teams to handle the processes. And we've talked about, Ravi talked about engineers and technical staff coming at a premium these days, but I think that goes further. Having qualified people in any function is a topic for any technology company out there, right? So you don't want to multiply the efforts that you have in your support team or your operations team just because they deal with different systems. So all of these things, and you're sharing the slide deck here, of course, should be taken into considerations as companies decide if they want to build or buy, and it should help drive the decision here.
Thanks, Nicole. So, there's this maxim, and maybe it's a little bit overused, but the only constant is change, and I still think it's true, and it's a maxim for a reason. So what are some of the events that can really pressure test your licensing and entitlement management system and make the build or buy decision even more critical? Nicole, let's start with you.
Yeah, something we already touched on, so I'll keep it short. M&A and new applications that are being brought to market, it'll happen at some point. And it's usually an event that triggers a discussion around the technology that is being used. And that is something that people should keep in mind and also get ready. You can get ready for M&A events by centralizing and standardizing systems before, so that you just plug in new solutions. If you're not set up in that way, then you are basically limiting your own scale to some extent, and that's something to think about.
Yeah. And Ravi, what about maintenance and feature enhancements to the solution that you might build?
Yeah, and as I mentioned, the subscription world has changed, everything. Expectations from customers are that, you're constantly evolving, constantly updating the solution because they paid for it and they expect things to change every day. And, unlike before where you could invest in a piece of functionality and then start to scale down the investment in that as, you evolve, you can't do that anymore. You have to keep that investment up and in some cases increase that investment depending on how people are viewing and consuming that piece of functionality. So you have to certainly keep that in mind to say that you have to invest a certain amount and you probably have to keep growing that amount, and that should factor in when you consider a build versus a buy decision.
Thanks, Ravi. And Urge, from a customer support, what about that perspective?
Well, licensing is typically the first interaction your end user is going to have with your software. So if that's a make or break interaction in my eyes anyway, because if you annoy your customers by having a bad licensing system, then that's it. The relationship is tainted from that point onwards. And who's going to bear the brunt of it? It's going to be customer support. So, if you're passionate about NPS scores and all of that stuff, then you need a robust, reliable entitlement management and licensing system.
Thanks, Urge. And I hopefully everybody on this call is very committed to NPS scores on the rise. So let's shift a little bit and now talk about business process. And Nicole, without industry or subject matter experience, it's really easy to lose sight of the big picture of how licensing and entitlement management should be integrated into a supplier's overall business. Can you talk a bit about this and some of the hidden risks and pitfalls of DIY?
Yeah, and we'll get to the full business process here, right? So bear with me here, right? When you build it yourself, what I often see is, and what's just natural, is that the group that builds a certain product would then build their own licensing and entitlement management functionality, which means that if you go with a do-it-yourself approach and you're a bigger software company that has different software products or acquires new products, at some point you end up with a view like the ones that you are seeing here. So you're basically ending up with silos. All of those might be different. There's no standardization, and that leads. It's not only the customer experience; it's also a big back-end risk and an integration risk. We'll talk about that, right? But this is what I usually see. If there's a do-it-yourself approach, there's hardly ever a company-wide initiative to standardize, right? It will be per product line. What it should be is what you're seeing here, right? The idea is that entitlement management, so basically the process of understanding what your customers own and translating that into application lifecycle and user lifecycle activities in which you manage what people can do in your application, that should be central. It shouldn't matter how many products you have, if they are SaaS or on-premise, or if they are embedded in devices or firmware. The entitlement management question is a business process, a business question, right? It should be handled in a central system. And then, of course, you've got different technologies to integrate with your different products, right? Some of them might be on premises, some of them might be in the cloud, and again, some might be in SaaS. That's cool, but in the end, everything should come together in a single back office. And why is it so important? It's so important because in the end, you want to have a single pane of glass. Just imagine you had different CRMs for all your different products. You end up in drama at some point, right? So we want the business systems standardized and centralized so that there's a single view and a single pane of glass on what your software business is. And then, of course, we come to the question of integration. If you want to move forward to the next slide, this is a very simplified view of the whole quote to cash process, right? But it highlights to you the systems that are at play for you to quote, sell, and sell software and to renew your customers. The sale usually happens in a CRM or CPQ process or in the ERP. That is basically where an opportunity gets created with a bunch of SKUs. And at some point, an opportunity becomes an order, it gets processed. At this point, this gets handed over to an entitlement management system where it gets handled, software gets delivered, the customer gets provisioned, and the revenue recognition is happening the moment you fulfill that order, right? And then, of course, there's usage happening. There might be a consumption event or whatever, and there's billing, right? The customer might be getting their monthly or their yearly bills. They might be getting bills for certain usage events. So there's an integration that's needed into a billing system. Very often, for example, that could be Oracle NetSuite. It could be another financial system. And then, of course, there's a whole management of the customer lifecycle to the renewal. So when you now think back to where we started here in that view in silos, right? If you have different homegrown systems for different products, you're multiplying your efforts to integrate with your Salesforce, with your NetSuite, with your SAP, or whatever you might have. And that in the end becomes something that's almost impossible to manage. And when you think about the maintenance, any bugs that you might see with the integration, any updates that you have to do as you are updating your upstream systems, it becomes too expensive to manage. It costs you time, and then also it's just something that could break. And then we talked about this before, but I want to highlight it again because I see it working with a lot of different companies. When you have those homegrown systems and you have homegrown integrations, very often it's like a never touch a running system strategy, right? As long as it's running, it's all cool. But then someone comes in and says, hey, we need to change our CRM process. We need to change our SKUs. We need to change the way we sell. And there's this big Salesforce process going on. And all of a sudden, no one in the company knows the integration to that downstream homegrown licensing system, right? And I've seen more often than not, I've seen situations in which that creates, something, it causes something to break. And then there might not even be someone in the company who knows how exactly that homegrown tool works, right? So that is just something to think about for building your own, I think, or yourself. Sometimes the back office integration might become more important even than some of the functions, right? Because if you don't have an automated back office process, it impacts all areas of your business, and it gets a lot of attention coming down from the management suite if things are not working in that area.
Thanks, Nicole. So we have covered a lot of ground, and we've discussed the challenges of a DIY approach. Ravi and Nicole, can you distill into your closing thoughts, what you think the audience should really take away from our session today?
Looking, I can start with kind of the functional requirements that you should think about. So there's, of course, the points that Urge brought up before. Licensing entitlement use cases are very specific. There's a lot to know. I am in that field for 8 years now, and I would say that multiple times a day I learn something new, right? And sometimes I learn even things that are surprising. Right, so it's a field that requires a lot of expertise, and companies like Revenera have built massive teams that focus on this and know this. So the amount of the years of knowledge that you get with a purpose-built solution is something that's invaluable, right? Then we talked a lot today about feature enhancement and customer support and how you should look at that and should look at that long-term for the benefit of your customers. And we just talked about integration. That is something that you should certainly answer for yourself and see, okay, what do I need here? Not only now, but also the next 3 to 5 years down the line. Because if you're making a decision to go down any path, no matter if you choose a vendor or if you build yourself, you don't want to come and revisit that decision 2 years later, right? You would like to stick with it for a time. So you should think about that and plan a few years out together with your management team to make sure that you're covered for the future too.
Right. So I'll start, we have a number of things listed there, but I'll start with focus. Even if you have, a large engineering team, it's important that you focus on your core competency. And diluting that with focusing on things that are, not your core IP, no matter how many resources you'll have, will just dilute it, and you may not end up doing a great job. So you need to keep that in mind. Obviously, we talked about engineering headcount and the challenges and the costs associated with bringing on board a new team and maintaining that team and ensuring that you are able to meet the needs of the changes and the maintenance that comes with this. I mean, updates and maintenance that have to come with the DIY approach that you take. And one thing that we didn't cover in the previous sections was dependency on third-party tools that get brought in. Third-party tools change over time. They have security issues or bugs within that, and less number of third-party tools to use, the better off you will be. So therefore, you need to keep that in mind in considering a DIY versus a buy approach.
Great. Thanks, Ravi. And thank you, Ravi, Nicole, and Urge. I know that you make this look very easy, but I think you've also demonstrated that there's a lot of complexity to the work that we do here at Revenera. And hopefully that's made the build or buy decision a little bit easier for people to come down and make a decision on. So thank you. It's always great chatting with you and getting your perspectives. Thank you all in the audience for joining us today. We'd also like to hear from you and get your insights and experience. You should be seeing a link to our annual Monetization Monitor survey on the screen, and we'll include it in our follow-up email along with a link to the recording of today's discussion. As you may know, our annual Monetization Monitor reports explore trends and drivers around software monetization, deployment and models and strategies, the impact of product usage analytics, and how software suppliers are dealing with license compliance and piracy. And we need input from you to make these reports meaningful and successful. So if you could take 12 minutes, because we're data-driven, to complete the survey, we'll make sure you get copies of the report as soon as they're available. You may also be interested in a webinar we have coming up in June, Implementing Use Rights for SaaS, Identity and Access versus Entitlement Management, something that Urge touched upon earlier. We're going to look at the challenges SaaS vendors face when growing their software monetization efforts and the relative strengths and weaknesses of IAM and entitlement management in that context. So thank you all for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. Hope you have a great day. Take care.